now we are ready to talk about technical photography. And this is what we are striving for in our photographs in order to have photographs that will meet all of our requirements. A good technical photograph. Technical photography is a style of photography. Technical photography is where we want everything in our view to be sharp and clear and correctly exposed, accurate. We want realism. We want it to look like it really is. And what makes a good technical photograph? Well, four things: correct exposure, maximum depth of field, free from distortion, and sharp focus. This is what we're striving for. It may be that we cannot get the greatest depth of field in a certain photograph because of certain circumstances. What we're going to find out when we get to depth of field is one of the things that affects depth of field is how close you are to whatever you're photographing. The closer you are to something you're focusing on, the less depth of field you will get. So what happens when we photograph a fingerprint? We get really shallow depth of field. Well, that's the best we're going to do because we have to get in close. So while these four things are on the screen, and that's what we're striving for, occasionally we can't hit them all perfectly, but we try. All right, so let's go through these one by one. Correct exposure. First of all, what is exposure? Well, exposure is the amount of light hitting our sensor to create an image. And basically, our sensor needs to see a certain level of light every time for a good result. So if we go out into bright sunlight and it's really bright, we have a whole lot of light, we still have to have this amount of light, the correct amount of light for our sensor to record an accurate photograph, a good photograph. And then later, if we go into a darker area and we have a lot less light, well, we still have to do something to make sure that the sensor receives the right amount of light so we have a good photograph. How do we do that? Well, that's where the exposure triangle comes into play. So there are three things that affect our exposure, getting that center amount. So if you're looking at my little image, we want to get the light to be right here. Not too much, not too little, just the right amount of light. Well, there's three things that will control the amount of light hitting our sensor. One is the aperture, which is also the f-stop. You may hear it that way. The aperture is the lens opening, how large the lens is open when the photograph is taken. Obviously, a large lens opening gives you more light than a small lens opening during an exposure. So that controls the amount of light that's going to hit the sensor. That's one of the things. And those settings for the aperture are called F numbers. And so you have numbers like F16, F11, F8. In the lens, there is an aperture device that opens and closes as you change the f-stops. When you snap the picture, the aperture closes down to whatever f-stop you just chose. The shutter, that controls how long the exposure is. The aperture controls the quantity of light. The shutter, it controls the duration of the exposure, how long the exposure is. Inside your camera, there is a shutter curtain. And what happens is the shutter will open, allow light in, and then it will close to cut off the light. And the shutter then is set for how long we want the shutter to be open. And those will be in a fraction of a second, or they could be in full seconds, minutes, or even hours if we have super long exposures. But typically we're dealing with fractions of a second. And when you see the numbers written or displayed, often they leave the 1/ off. So if it's a 1/25 of a second, it'll actually just shows 125. But when you get to a full second, then it puts a little quote mark behind the 1, And now you know you're in full seconds. So then if you see a 2, it's 2 seconds. If you see a 2 without a quote, it's a half a second. Over here on our slide, the shutter speed is how long the shutter is open. It's the duration. The longer the shutter is open, the more light comes through. The shorter the duration, less light can come through. So now we see we have the aperture that's controlling how much quantity as far as the size of the lens opening to allow light through at any given point. And then you have the shutter that is opening and closing, and that's controlling the duration, how long that amount of light can come through. Those two factors give us our exposure. But there's one other, that's the ISO. That's what the sensitivity of the sensor itself. That's part of this exposure triangle. Remember, what we're going to do for our pictures is leave our ISO on 200 for our daylight pictures and use 400 for our night pictures in our flash photographs. So we want to leave the ISO alone and control the other two. So what's going on? Well, we set our ISO, and now we need this amount of light to come through. We choose an f-stop, the aperture that is, and a shutter speed that will give us this amount of light. So how do we go about choosing that? Well, the good thing about all this is our camera is going to help us get the right combination of shutter speed and f-stop to give us this amount of light every time. Though it could be wrong occasionally, and that is something we have to watch for, and we're going to talk about that as we go along. Given that exposure triangle and how those three things work together, we're only going to use 2 because the ISO is going to stay the same. How do we then find out what that middle part is? Well, as I said, our camera will allow us to do it. And that is where our exposure modes come into play. If you look over on the top left, if this is all you have on your command dial to work with, then your camera is not suitable for crime scene and evidence use because everything is automatic or programmed mode. Let me explain that. When you put it in auto, it's just going to act as if it's a point and shoot camera, and it's going to do whatever it wants to do. You have no control over other than you're pointing it and pushing the shutter button. That's it. Now, the other symbols like the little running man, and then there's a head and shoulders and a mountain range, and then a tulip. Well, those are for the program modes. One is for fast moving subjects. That's why it has a little running man. It's for sports. So what it's going to do is use faster shutter speeds generally. Then you have a portrait mode. That's going to generally use a lens opening so your background's out of focus. So it's presetting what combinations it's going to use, and you have no clue really what's going on other than this general idea. So that's not what we want. We want more control over our cameras. So forget that one on the top left. On the top right, we have one with a command dial here that here is where you can set your exposure modes. So there's an M, an A, an S, and a P. This would be for cameras other than Canon. Instead of S, Canon will use TV, time value. And instead of A, it has AV, which is aperture value. So it's just a little different. But it also has these program modes. Notice that on this particular model. And it also has an auto setting. You don't want to use those. So those are the different modes. On the bottom image, this was a liquid crystal display. The liquid crystal display shows what mode you're in here. So this is in a program mode, but otherwise it would show an M for manual, S for shutter speed priority, A for aperture priority. This is a Canon, but what we can see here is in the display on the back of your camera, it can show you the shutter speed you're set at, the aperture the camera's set at, your ISO, and the mode that you're in. So here's where we would want to be in shutter speed priority mode or aperture priority mode instead of program mode. We'll talk about that in a moment. So you set your mode, then you set whatever you're in control of, the camera does the rest. What happens in these modes? Let's start with shutter speed priority mode. What does a shutter speed priority mode do? Well, it requires me to set a shutter speed for the photograph, and then the camera will automatically choose the aperture to go with it to give me the right amount of light. All right, so I choose the shutter speed in shutter speed priority, which is the S or the TV, and then the camera will automatically choose the aperture or f-stop to give us this amount of light. Very cool. Now I'm totally in control, because if I don't like the aperture the camera is going to give me, I can see what it is. It's going to show me that. I can just change my shutter speed and now force the camera to give me a better f-stop or aperture. What about aperture priority? That would be the A, or in Canon, AV. Well, in that case, you have to set the f-stop or aperture. Those two I'm using interchangeably. And then the camera will automatically choose the shutter speed to give you this amount of light. So you're still in control. You choose an f-stop, it's going to display the shutter speed. If for some reason you don't like that shutter speed, you can say, change the f-stop, because that's what you're in control of. And it's now going to display a new shutter speed, and it will give you that amount of light. So you see, by using the automatic modes in our camera, we can get the right amount of light every time and still be in control of what's going on without using the program mode. One exception: when you are doing flash photography, use the program mode, because the cameras are designed for optimal results with your flash in program mode. Now, this is for the built-in flash and for a dedicated flash that's designed to work on your camera, where the camera and the flash are communicating. So that would be a time you would use programmed, but for everything else, all daylight, ambient light photographs, we're going to either be in shutter priority, aperture priority, or we could be in manual. Manual is really simple. Everyone is a photographer until they find the manual mode. Well, the manual mode's really simple. Basically, in the manual mode, the camera is going to tell you when you have a correct combination. Let's move on and talk more about exposure. So that's how the systems work, how your camera generally works. Let's now talk about, for technical photography, this correct exposure. And what is a correct exposure? That's getting the right amount of light for a good overall exposure or view. Now, a lot of our exposures are going to look like the image we see on the screen here. This is a photograph of a building in direct sunlight. You may notice that there are some really dark areas and some really bright areas. And if you take a picture and then you look at this result, you might say to yourself, well, gosh, when I took the picture, I could see the detail there, but it went black. And I could see the detail here, but it went all washed out. That's because our cameras cannot do what our eyes and brain can do. When you and I are looking at the scene, we have much more latitude. We can see much more than the camera can reproduce. So that's just one thing to be aware of. And that's one thing to be cautious about, because if all my evidence is in this dark area here, I just lost it. Well, Steve, can't you go into Photoshop and make that brighter? Well, yeah, you can make that brighter in Photoshop, but you know what? If it didn't record, it's not going to appear in Photoshop. So if it's too dark, no, you're not going to see anything, even if you lighten it up. This photograph, which is a fairly good exposure, was taken with a fairly fast shutter speed and a fairly large lens opening so that I got just the right amount. I don't remember exactly what my settings were. It's not really important, but that's what I did. Now look at the next picture. The next picture, the exposure is almost identical. But this photograph I took with a much slower shutter speed and at the same time a smaller lens opening to give me this amount of light. So what I'm saying is you just have to find the balance, and that's what your automatic settings allow you to do. If I change the shutter speed, because I'm in shutter speed priority, I make the shutter speed faster, well, the lens opening is going to be larger, is going to become larger so that I get the right amount of light as well. If I use a larger lens opening, the shutter speed will become faster so I get the right amount of light. So we have two exposures there with completely different settings. So let's say that I point my camera at something and I'm in shutter priority. I could be in aperture priority, it doesn't matter. And it just indicates to me that a correct exposure for whatever I'm taking a picture of is a 500th of a second at f4. That's not the only exposure that is correct for this situation, for that amount of light. Also, a 250th of a second at f5.6 will give me the same amount of light. A 1/25th of a second at f8 gives me the same amount of light. A 1,000th of a second at f2.8 gives me the same amount of light. These are called equivalent exposures. Now, you don't have to memorize that chart because all you need to know is if I change my shutter speed, my aperture has to follow in order to give me the same amount of light. Here I have a photograph of a vehicle traveling down a roadway. This photograph is well exposed. Again, there's dark areas because there's shadows. There's brighter areas because there's direct sunlight. Our eyes can see more detail in those areas, but the camera won't. But this is overall is a decent exposure. But notice that this vehicle is blurred. Well, that's because even though I used a correct exposure, I used a relatively slow shutter speed. Matter of fact, I used a 15th of a second. So the shutter was open for a fairly long period of time, and whatever f-stop went with it. I just let the camera tell me what f-stop to use. If I have shutter speed priority, I just put it on a 15th of a second. It's going to show me the f-stop, and I snap the picture. Well, the problem here is, even though it's a good exposure, I've got the blurred car. So what happens if I change my shutter speed and I photograph the next vehicle going by? Now I'm using a 500th of a second, a much shorter duration, a faster shutter speed. It's going to freeze the movement more. And now I have a good exposure again because I was in shutter speed priority. So the camera changes the f-stop to go along with my new shutter speed. And now I have stop movement and a good overall photograph again. So that is equivalent exposures. Now, another thing about exposure that's really important, and that is our camera can easily be fooled. Now, in a way, it's not being fooled because it's just doing what it's designed to do, but we can end up with a result we do not like at all. Here is a photograph of a white car in direct sunlight. The sunlight's coming over my shoulder, hitting this vehicle and reflecting toward the camera. I have my camera in shutter speed priority. It could even be in aperture priority. It would get the same result. And I choose a shutter speed. It gives me an f-stop and I say, hey, cool, I'll use that f-stop. And I take the picture and it came out too dark. And why is that? It's because the camera is basing everything it sees on what's normal. There's a metering system in the camera that reads reflected light. It's a reflective meter. It sees the light reflecting off of whatever is in front of the camera, whatever you're pointing the camera at. So the light reflects back, the sensor in the meter of the camera reads that, and then it determines what your setting needs to be. So what is it looking for? Well, it's looking for what is average. And the average of all reflected light is 18% reflectance. When we look at this picture, we have bright sunlight reflecting off of a white surface. That's not 18% reflectance. That's more like 80% reflectance. So the camera is going to go, whoa, look at all that light, and give us an underexposed photograph because it doesn't know any better. So what do? One thing we could do is take the picture and look in the review screen and see that we have to make an adjustment. But what I would much prefer is for you to look at this before you took the picture and know there's going to be a problem. So what do? Well, I need the camera to understand what it's looking at. This is where the gray card can come in handy. So the gray card is 18% reflectance. The light bouncing off of it will give you 18% reflectance. So what I need to do is hold this gray card in front of my camera, letting the light hit the gray card the same way it's hitting the car in my subject, and allow the meter to adjust the settings for 18% reflectance. And if I do that, and then I take the picture, this is what I will get instead. Now that is much more accurately done. Again, we have limitations. Super bright areas are going to be kind of blown out because our camera can't handle it. And dark areas will be a shadow because our camera can't handle it. You may have been able to see detail there, but keep in mind, it may not show in your photograph. You may have to take additional photographs to compensate. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, you don't have to put the gray card right up against the car and walk up and do it that way. As long as the light is hitting the gray card the same way it's hitting the car, you're going to be just fine. Now, what happens if you're in automatic? You've set your shutter speed. You show the camera the gray card. It changes the f-stop to what it should be. And now you take the card away to take your picture. What's going to happen? Well, the camera's going to readjust. It's going to end up giving you this result again. So what do we do to make it stay? Well, there happens to be a setting on your camera, a button on your camera usually, that you can press that will lock your exposure. So on my camera, I have an AEL button. Here's the shutter button up here. Right about where my thumb will rest, there is a button here and it says AEL. That's automatic exposure lock. So I show the camera, this is 18% reflectance. I push the AEL button in, move the card and snap the picture, and I'm all done. Another way you could do this is with bracketing, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. Let's look at a couple other things here. Here is a photograph in the snow, and I think we would all agree this picture is a little bit dark. Well, that's because I just went ahead and let the camera tell me what to do. I set a shutter speed, it gave me an f-stop, and I snapped the picture. Why is it a little dark? Well, because most of the scene is white. So similar to the last photograph, a lot of light, especially if the sun is out, and in this case, it was actually still snowing, so it still works then too, you end up with the light reflecting off of the snow. The camera turns the white snow into 18% reflectance, or gray, middle gray, and now your snow is gray. What should we do? Well, we want to go ahead and show the camera what is 18% reflectance, and then we end up with the snow looking white. This is a much better example than that. That one's definitely too dark. This one is better. So we're looking at this photograph, and what I want to point out is this is front lighting. The light is striking the front of your subject. Notice in this front lit photograph that we can't see much detail in the hair. We can't see any detail in his right ear. We don't see any detail in the eye. We don't see any detail in the white t-shirt here or in the shadow here. But let me tell you, when I took this photograph with my eye, I could see the hairs. I could see the color eyes. I could see the detail in his ear. I could see the wrinkles in the Chuck E. Cheese t-shirt. I could see the weeds that needed to be pulled out of the lawn. But they're gone. Why is that? Well, I mentioned this before. The camera has less latitude in what it can record than our eyes and brains do. When you and I are looking at a subject, there's a lot of work going on with our brain, our eye, as we gaze into bright areas. Our pupil constricts, our brain processes, we see detail. As we look into shadow areas, our eye dilates, our brain processes. It's a constant thing going on. Plus, there's just this whole latitude thing. If we took what we can see and broke it into 1,000 shades of gray, from pure white to pure black, there'd be 1,000 steps of gray that we could actually see. Well, what can the camera see out of that? Maybe about 80 steps. Well, everything that's brighter than the 80 steps becomes white in our picture. Everything darker than the 80 steps in our photograph becomes black, because that can't be seen by the camera. Everything brighter than the 80 steps becomes white. We lose detail. Everything less than the 80 steps becomes black. We don't see the detail. This is important because let's say I'm photographing a body in the bright sunlight, and in the shadow there's a gun, and it happens to be a blue steel revolver. Well, when you go to look at your photograph later, you may not find a gun. And now you're trying to convince everybody there was a gun next to the body. And what's the defense going to do? They're going to use your picture to show, we don't see any gun. Of course, you're going to have to explain it, and maybe the jury will be fine with that. But why even let that come up? Plus, you just lost a lot of your evidence by hiding it in the shadow. By the way, did you notice the evidence in the picture of the car? Let me show you. The first photograph that the camera wanted me to take, there's absolutely no way you can see in that shadow. Now let's go to the overall brightness being correct. I can barely see it. So what do we need to do instead? We need a picture like this. Knowing the limitations of my camera, I can take two photographs. I can take one like this, and then take a second photograph exposed for the shadow area. So how do I do that? Well, I just take my camera and I get right up to the shadow, stick my camera in the shadow, let it tell me what f-stop it needs to use, hit the AEL button, step back, and take this photograph. Most of it's going to blow out from too much light, but the shadow area will be exposed properly and we'll see the gun. Now, there is another way you can do that, and that's with flash fill. Flash fill is where I can fill the shadow with flash. I will talk about that at another time. So this is side lighting. The light is hitting the side of our subject, coming into the side like this. And then you have shadow on the opposite side. Again, something to be aware of. And then this would be backlighting. The light is hitting the back of your subject. Now, this can be a problem area too, because we can end up with the subject turning into more of a silhouette, because the camera may be reading all this bright area behind it. This is where understanding your light meter in your camera can be helpful. So I want to take a moment to talk about metering systems. There are several metering schemes. Again, what your camera is doing is reading the reflected light from your subject, comes into the camera, and then that helps for it to decide what your setting should be. The metering can be of a different type or pattern. First of all, there is spot metering. Spot metering is a small area. It's just going to read like this kid's face. If you have your camera set to spot metering, it's just going to read that small area, and everything else will not be in the equation for the exposure. Now, a spot meter would be great here because it's going to just read the shadow area, and that would be fine. I'll get a good exposure. But another type of meter is the center weighted averaging, takes everything into account and averages it to come up with a reading, but gives more weight to the center. In that case, you may end up with underexposed picture, not enough light, because it's reading more of the light in the background, and it turns this darker. And then the third kind of metering that we normally see is the matrix metering or the evaluative metering. Depends on what the camera manufacturer wants to call it. Matrix metering is different in that it actually divides the area into zones. It could be 4 zones, it could be 100 zones. It depends on the camera. And it evaluates each zone to try to figure out what it's actually looking at. Could this be a silhouette situation, a backlit situation? Could this be a lot of sky in the upper part and darker area in the bottom part? And so the camera will try to be smart enough to figure out what exposure to give you based on what the lighting is telling is going on. Now, what do? I leave my camera on matrix metering because it works really well in most situations, but I still look for backlit situations. I look for shadows that have evidence. I look for highlights that have evidence, and I do whatever I need to do to compensate, because my camera is not designed to look for evidence. It just looks for patterns. Now, this doesn't just mean when you photograph someone standing in the sun and the sunlight's behind them. It could be a crime scene. Maybe you have a telephone pole and it's got graffiti on it, and you're trying to photograph that at a homicide scene. Maybe it's some gang tagging. Well, if the sunlight's coming from behind the telephone pole towards you, and you go and take this picture with your averaging meter, you could end up with too dark of a pole and maybe not be able to improve much in Photoshop. So that's backlighting. So we're still talking about correct exposure, one of the 4 things we need for a good technical photograph. This is a camera simulator. I can set this up to either be for a Canon or a Nikon. I have it on Canon right now. But what we have here is looking in the viewfinder. When you look in the viewfinder on the Canon, not all of them are this way, but we have the shutter speed here. This would be the f-stop, the aperture f number. This is the ISO. In a Nikon, this is the shutter speed, the f-stop. Let's go ahead and go back to the Canon to start with. And let's say we're going to use our normal lens. So I have focal length over here. So I need to put this on 31 millimeters. And it's mostly sunny. And in this case, we're focusing at, let's say, 8 feet. All right. I'm in shutter speed priority on ISO 200, like I recommended we do. All right, so I'm in shutter speed priority, and let's say that I choose, since I'm in shutter speed priority, I choose the shutter speed. The camera will then give me the f-stop to go with it. So I'm going to choose a 1/25th of a second. The camera is going to give me f8, and we see it read out here. So if I snap the picture, there is my photograph, which looks pretty good. But let's say that I choose a slower shutter speed. Let's say I want to go with a 1/30th of a second. Well, now the camera, as you noticed in shutter speed priority, when I went from a 1/25th, notice the aperture button here, or even look at it in the viewfinder. When I change this to a 30th of a second, it's now going to give me a f16. So now I'm going to snap the picture, but look what happened. We have movement in the picture. So she's rocking back and forth. You know, there might even be a little camera movement because it's hard to hold the camera steady at a 30th of a second. And then also the wind is turning this pinwheel, so we see the result we get. So that's not going to be good. We need to stick with the faster shutter speeds. So if I put it on a 500th of a second, it's going to use f4, so I can take that. Let's go to aperture priority. Aperture priority, I choose the aperture, the f-stop, and the camera chooses the shutter speed to go with it. So if I choose f11, in this case, it wants to use a 60th of a second. We get a little bit of movement there. Let's change the lighting. So if it's overcast, we're going to have a lot less light here. You know, it doesn't seem like a lot less to us because our eyes adjust for it, but for the camera, it's a lot less. And so if I'm in aperture priority and I still want to use f11, now it has to use a 1/5 of a second. What does that do for us? Not good at all. Now we could go ahead and put our camera on a tripod. That's going to eliminate the movement of our camera, but it won't change the movement of our subject. We see the background is still because we're using a tripod, but because she was rocking back and forth and because the pinwheel is moving, that becomes a problem. Okay, so what we need to do is a faster shutter speed. So this would be a time that I would probably think of using shutter speed priority because I know I need to stop the movement. If my camera only goes to f2.8, if you get past whatever the maximum aperture is, it's going to blink at you. That's a warning. It'll still let you take the picture, but see how dark it came out? Because you've exceeded what it really can do. So if you see the f-stop blinking at you, then you need to make adjustments. Same thing with the Nikon. See the F number is blinking. That's a warning. It'll still let you take the picture, but your picture will be underexposed, or it could even be overexposed if it's f22 blinking at you. Okay, well let's look at manual. Okay, with manual, and let me go back to the Canon. With manual, you have to look at this scale across the bottom. This indicator should be right in the middle where this triangle is for what the camera believes is a correct exposure. So if I'm in manual, this is just giving me a suggestion. So what I need to do is start changing my aperture. Oh, wrong way. That's not going to help. I need to get that little indicator under here. So I need to slow down the shutter speed. So at 2.8 at an 1/8 of a second, I can take this picture and I'll have a good exposure. But let's say that I can't get to 2.8. Maybe my camera only goes to 4.5. What this is doing is it's showing me that I'm more than one stop. I'm 1 1/3 stops underexposed. It's a little hard to see, but there's a minus on this end and a plus on this end. So over here, it's warning me, or it's indicating I'm going to be underexposed by 1 1/3 stops. So that is a full stop, that's 2 full stops, and then these are 1/3 stop indicators. So what do I have to do? Well, I've got to change my shutter speed, slow it down to let in more light. So now I'm at a 1/30th of a second at 4.5. If I take the picture, I'm okay. However, she's still moving. So you see all the things that come into play here. In the Nikon, very similar, but a little simpler. It's got the plus and minus, and they're full stops. So right now, if I change this to a 60th of a second, you notice it's all the way down here. I'm underexposed one stop. So these are one stop and two stop. So I'm underexposed one stop. What does that mean? It's 1/2 the amount of light. Or if I'm overexposed a stop, it's twice the amount of light. And if I do take that picture, it comes out too dark. So once again, what I have to do is change this to get that little light to light up where I want it. If I'm over there, I'm 2 stops overexposed. So manual is actually easy to use. You have the little guide and you just make your selections. Also, it's an easy place to do bracketing. To help us to get the correct exposure, we may decide to use a technique called bracketing. Bracketing is where we can take several photographs. Sometimes it's just 2, sometimes it may be 3. In evidence photography, it may be 5. It all depends on the situation. Where you're at different settings, so you get different levels of light. And then later, when you're in Photoshop, you have the option to deal with the different exposures and come out with the best result. So how do we do bracketing? Well, we basically just take more than one photograph and use different settings, and I'll show you how to set that up. So here we have a photograph that shows a truck, and under the truck there is a pistol. Now, fortunately, this is concrete and not asphalt. If it was asphalt, it would be probably just as hard to see as in that previous picture of a car with a gun under it. But here it's pretty dark. Well, if I want to show both the vehicle and the gun well, I need to take an additional photograph here as one of my techniques. I can bracket by opening up some. This, to me, when I look at it, I think I need to open up 1 or 1/3 stops, just based on my experience. And so let's say I go ahead and I open up 1 stop and I take a second photograph. Now, here I have this picture exposed for the shadow area. Yes, the rest kind of blew out, but now I have 2 photographs instead of 1. So that's my bracketing. So how do we go about doing bracketing? On most cameras, you're going to have a button you can push someplace. Many of them have this plus minus button. When you press that button, then you're in control here. So this works when you're in automatic. So you're in shutter speed priority or you're in aperture priority mode. And so if I want to bracket, let's say I want to open up 1 stop, I go ahead and I press that button that we see up here at the top left. Then right below it, we see the indicator appear, and I turn one of the knobs on my camera, one of the dials or knobs, and I reposition this right under the 1. This would be what it looks like in another viewfinder. On mine, when I press that plus minus button there, I get the 0.0, meaning there is no compensation at all. It's where it should be. And then as I turn one of the dials with my thumb, I believe it is, this will change. It'll go plus 0.1 or minus 0.1 and so forth. And so you just dial it there in that display. But most of them have it this way, which makes it pretty simple. So if I want to bracket, let's say 1 stop each direction off of normal, maybe I've got a lot of bright areas, a lot of shadow areas, and I'm just taking a picture to show the outside of this building. Well, I may go ahead and just bracket by shooting 1 at the 0, the normal, then press this plus minus button, change it to +1, take a second shot, move it to -1, take a third shot. Then When I'm done doing that, I have to remember to press this plus minus one more time and return this indicator back to 0. Otherwise, all my subsequent photographs are going to be off by one stop as well. Another thing that we can do with exposure is high dynamic range photography, or HDR. HDR is where you can take a series of photographs and then blend them together to have your finished photograph. I'm going to go ahead and let's say I want, again, to get this photograph here. I'm going to go ahead and take 2 pictures. This is the photograph with the normal lighting, and we have a little bit of a shadow. Then I'm going to take the second photograph, which is exposed for the shadow area, and this gets blown out. Then what I do is I take those 2 exposures into my computer and I do the HDR technique. And the HDR then gives me a new image where it blends them. And this is what the result looks like. So here is one photograph, second photograph, and then the blended. Another way to ensure our exposures is with flash fill. Remember, under the car, there is a pistol there in the shadow. This is at taking the picture normally. If I point my flash at the same time under the car, then often I can light that area up with flash. And so I end up with a result like this. Technical photography. We need to have correct exposure. The next thing we're also concerned about is maximum depth of field.